Greetings and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Dr. C. Today we're discussing the endocrine system. This video is part 1 of 3. When we discuss the endocrine system, it's important to realize that in order to send messages throughout the body, our cells are actually able to communicate with other cells, and that helps to maintain how our body chemistry is controlled. We're going to take a closer look at that. The endocrine system uses chemical messengers known as hormones to relay information or instructions from cells in certain parts of the body to other cells in other parts of the body. And we have specific organs with specific tissues and cells that are capable of doing this. And this is one way of how our body can regulate long-term processes like growth, development, reproduction. And this is, again, a way of our body using special chemical messengers called hormones to affect metabolic activities in every cell and tissue. You'll remember that metabolism is the sum of all chemical processes within the body, both anabolic, which are processes that put things together or build things, and catabolic, which are processes that break things down. The endocrine system is tied in with the nervous system, and both of these systems together help our bodies maintain homeostasis. You'll recall that homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain a relatively stable internal environment despite changes. And those changes also have to be within a certain range. There are limitations of matter where if things get too far out of whack, our bodies are not going to handle that well. So the nervous system and the endocrine system can work together as one system to perform general functions of communication, integration, and control. If we look at the picture on this particular slide, we can see the hypothalamus has a direct connection to and communicates with one of the major organs in the endocrine system, which is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland technically is a neuroendocrine gland because there are neurons that go from the hypothalamus directly into the pituitary gland. We know in terms of neural signaling that the nervous system helps to send signals electrically through electrical signals called action potentials, as well as chemically through neurotransmitters. We also understand that the nervous system uses messages that are very rapid, very short-lived, very local. When we looked at the somatic nervous system, we saw how neurons communicated with skeletal muscle, and that was a very direct, rapid signal. And we looked at the autonomic nervous system where we have neurons that also communicate with other organs in the body, and we know that the nervous system can go directly to the adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion of the adrenal gland, for epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released throughout the bloodstream. And once things go into the bloodstream, they circulate throughout the body. So those effects are longer than having a chemical message or neurotransmitter being delivered from a neuron to an effector, which is a muscle or gland. So nervous system, very rapid. Endocrine system, much longer effect. As a quick refresher for neural signaling, you'll recall that an action potential will travel the length of an axon until it reaches the axon terminal. Upon reaching the axon terminal, the change in voltage will cause voltage-gated calcium channels to open, allowing an influx of calcium. The influx of calcium causes synaptic vesicles to fuse their membranes with the membrane of the axon terminal, allowing a neurotransmitter to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to specialized receptors. We know that the response is going to be very rapid, very brief and results in things like movement or sensation or cognition, depending on what's being communicated from one neuron to either another neuron or an effector, which is a muscle or a gland. The endocrine system utilizes chemicals called hormones in order to communicate. Where in the nervous system we have neurons with axons that go to a specific location, the endocrine system releases chemical messengers called hormones into the bloodstream. Once those hormones are released into the bloodstream, they travel throughout the body in order to reach their target organs. When they release their target organs, they'll bind to specific cells within specific tissues in those organs. And the binding of hormones to those receptors forms what's called a hormone receptor complex. Because endocrine hormones have to travel throughout the bloodstream, the signaling process in the endocrine system often takes longer, but it's also longer lasting than neural signaling. If you look at the picture on this slide, you'll see that depiction of hormones being released into the bloodstream and traveling to specific areas in the body. This particular chart gives us a great comparison between the signaling that occurs between the nervous system and the endocrine system. If we look at the nervous system first, all the way on the right-hand side, you'll notice that with signaling we get both chemical neurotransmitters and electrical action potentials. We have a very short distance where the message is released chemically in terms of neurotransmitters. There's always a short distance in the synapse, and we get fast response times. We have internal signals and external signals. What's an external signal? If I walk outside in the winter without a coat and it's cold, I'm going to detect that. I have sensory mechanisms in my skin. And if we look overall at reaction times, how things stop and how things adapt, the nervous system is generally quick. In comparison, the endocrine system, we only use chemicals called hormones. The distance traveled can be long or short. Maybe the chemical is being released from one thing to something that's not too far away. So it's long or short, whereas with the nervous system, always short. Response time can be fast or slow depending on how close things are. And the environment that's targeted in the endocrine system is always going to be internal. And the endocrine system is going to react slowly, stop slowly, and adapt slowly. When we talk about the endocrine system, we see that the endocrine system is made up of specific structures called endocrine glands. They're the major players. And endocrine glands are ductless. They actually secrete hormones directly into the interstitial fluid that surrounds the cells, which will diffuse into the bloodstream and get carried throughout the body by way of the bloodstream. Some endocrine glands have both endocrine and non-endocrine functions. There are other organs in the body that have the capability of producing and releasing hormones into the bloodstream. These organs include things like the heart, the kidneys, the stomach, the small intestines, adipose connective tissue, osseous connective tissue. We'll discuss these later. There are other types of chemical signaling that occur in the body that are not considered part of the endocrine system simply because the chemicals that are released don't go into the bloodstream. Autocrine signaling is one of these methods where a cell releases chemicals that in turn act on the cell that released them. Remember, auto means self, autocrine, self-signaling. A good example of this would be interleukin 1, which is involved in inflammation. There are some smooth muscle cells that produce and release prostaglandins that in turn cause those smooth muscle cells to contract. Another type of signaling mechanism that's not part of the endocrine system is paracrine signaling, where cells release chemicals that affect their neighbors. An example of paracrine signaling would be in the pancreas. There are certain pancreatic cells that produce somatostatin that when somatostatin is released actually inhibits the beta cells in the pancreatic islets of Langerhans. It inhibits them from producing insulin. So those are just a couple of examples. And paracrine signaling can also involve things like histamine, growth factors, neurotransmitters. Those are involved in paracrine signaling. As hormones circulate through the body, they kind of act like bulk mail advertisements. Everybody gets them. Not everybody wants them. So even though hormones are going to be exposing themselves to all the cells in the body, they only affect those cells that have receptors to respond to those specific chemical messages. And hormones act to alter the metabolism of the operations within cells. So they can change types, quantities, activities of enzymes and proteins. Our next slide shows us a little bit more in depth exactly what they do. What do hormones do? They can stimulate the synthesis of enzymes or proteins by activating genes within the nucleus of the cell. They can activate or deactivate enzymes. They can increase or decrease the rate of synthesis of enzymes or proteins. They can turn existing enzymes or protein membrane channels on or off by changing their shape, and that can alter the permeability of the membrane to specific things. They can also induce the secretory activity of a cell as well as stimulate mitosis. Endocrine glands produce a lot more hormone molecules than we need, and anything that's not used eventually is going to be excreted in the urine or broken down by metabolic processes. Receptors have to be specific for the hormone molecules that are going to bind to them. They have to have the correct shape in order for the hormone to bind. We refer to that as hormone specificity. Overall, our hormones are so important because they help regulate things like reproduction, growth, metabolism, development, fluid balance, sleep. So many other body functions are regulated by our hormones. The next part of our journey in the endocrine system is going to be taking a closer look at hormones and their functions. Just by looking at this picture and seeing all the different organs and the types of hormones they make, you know we've got a lot to learn. Let's get started. When we look more closely at hormones, we can see that they can be classified according to chemical structure. Remember that structure function is so important when it comes to how the human body operates, even at a chemical level. When we look at the different classifications that are in this chart, we see that we've got hormones that are derived from amino acids, including amines, peptides, proteins, and glycoproteins. Those chemical compounds are not fat soluble. Therefore, they require cell membrane receptors in order to get into the cell. However, hormones that are lipid-based, which we call steroid hormones, are going to be lipid soluble, they diffuse right through the plasma membrane, and their receptors are actually inside the cell in the cytoplasm. If we look at this chart, steroid hormones, which are formed from cholesterol, basically include estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, and cortisol. So the minority of our hormones are going to be steroid hormones. There are 20 different amino acids found in the human body. Amine hormones are made up from 2 of the 20 amino acids. Tyrosine is one amino acid that is involved in making thyroid hormone and the catecholamine group, which includes epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Our body can actually make tyrosine. Tryptophan is an amino acid that's called an essential amino acid because we have to get it from our diet. And tryptophan is the precursor for the amine hormones melatonin and serotonin. If you look at the top of this chart, you'll see the amine hormone norepinephrine, and you'll see that it's a relatively small molecule. Peptide hormones are made up of multiple groups of amino acids, so they're bigger. This includes glycoproteins like thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, human chorionic gonadotrophin, as well as short chain polypeptides and small proteins like growth hormone, prolactin, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and insulin. Here you can see a picture of insulin with its 51 amino acids put together. Remember, we have 20 amino acids in our body, 20 different amino acids, but we can put those together in different combinations to make these chains. Finally, we have lipid derivatives, which we call our steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol molecules. These include testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol. Now, there is a class of chemicals called Eicosanoids, and these are derived from a 20-carbon fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and Eicosanoids are not considered part of the endocrine system because they include prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which we already know act as autocrines and paracrines, respectively. There are different ways that hormones can affect cells, depending on whether or not they need to bind to a receptor to have an effect, or whether they can actually enter through the plasma membrane without binding to a receptor first. Even though this particular slide shows 6 different ways that hormones can potentially affect cells, we're going to focus on 2. First, we're going to take a look at non-steroid hormone action. You'll recall that steroid hormones can go right through the plasma membrane because they are fat soluble. Non-steroid hormones require a protein receptor within the plasma membrane of the cell. You'll notice in this picture there's not only a cell membrane receptor, there's also a special protein that is bound to that receptor called a G protein. When an amine, peptide, protein, or glycoprotein, those are all our non-steroid hormones, when one of those binds to a cell membrane receptor, that activates the G protein. The G protein dissociates or breaks apart from the receptor and is transported along the inside of the plasma membrane to bind to adenylyl cyclase, which is an enzyme. Remember that enzymes tend to end in ASE. Once adenylyl cyclase is activated, it converts adenosine triphosphate into a second messenger molecule known as cyclic adenosyl monophosphate. Cyclic adenosyl monophosphate, as a second messenger molecule, is going to travel through the cytoplasm of the cell to activate other enzymes known as protein kinases. When protein kinases are activated by cyclic adenosyl monophosphate, they in turn will add phosphate groups to other proteins in the cytoplasm in a process. I'm having a difficult time speaking today. In a process known as phosphorylation. That activates those other proteins, allowing them to alter the activity that they do in the cell. Remember, if we change the structure, we change the function. Let me see if I can do better on the next slide. Normally, I cut my bloopers out and just redo it. I think maybe it's kind of fun to see when I mess up. Next, we're going to take a look at steroid hormone action. Remember, all hormones need receptors. It's just that non-steroid hormones have receptors that are going to be on the plasma membrane, within the plasma membrane, whereas steroid hormones have receptors in the cytoplasm of the cell because steroid hormones can go right through that plasma membrane. And that's what we see here in this picture. We have a lipid-soluble hormone, a steroid hormone, and that can go right through, it can diffuse through the plasma membrane. That hormone will bind to a receptor within the cytoplasm, forming a receptor hormone complex, and that receptor hormone complex will go into the nucleus of the cell that triggers the transcription, the information on how to make proteins from a gene on the DNA. Remember, genes are just pieces of DNA, segments of DNA, that carry instructions on building specific proteins. So we first trigger transcription, and then once the messenger RNA is complete, that will exit the nucleus and join up with ribosomes to be translated into proteins. And those proteins have a function, and they will carry out whatever specific function they're supposed to have at that point. Our bodies can actually regulate sensitivity to hormones, and that happens at the cellular level. Usually, if the level of hormone decreases, cells will create more receptors, and that's a process known as upregulation. It takes a little bit of time, but you can see in the picture at the top of this slide the process of upregulation, creating more receptors to make the cell more sensitive to the hormone that is circulating through the bloodstream. Conversely, downregulation can also occur where the cell starts to withdraw or decrease the number of hormone receptors, decreasing the sensitivity of the cell. And that very commonly happens with type 2 diabetes mellitus, because when a person has lots of sugar in his or her bloodstream and there's lots of insulin being created by the pancreas to help try and get the sugar from the bloodstream into the cells are like, we don't want to be bombarded with insulin, we're tired of it. And so they actually start withdrawing their receptors on the plasma membrane surface. That is what is known as downregulation. Because multiple hormones circulate through the bloodstream, and because some hormones can act on the same target cell at the same time, it's possible to see combined actions of those hormones. One type of combined action is known as permissiveness, which occurs when a hormone can't exert all of its effects without the presence of another hormone. A great example of this occurs with gonadal hormones and thyroid hormone. Gonadal hormones are responsible for the development of the reproductive system. Thyroid hormone is responsible for the timely development of the reproductive system. In the absence of thyroid hormone, the development of the reproductive system is delayed. Another type of combined action is known as synergism. Synergism occurs when more than one hormone produces the same effects, and those combined effects are added together or amplified. A great example of this occurs with epinephrine and glucagon. Epinephrine and glucagon both cause the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream. With combined effects of epinephrine and glucagon, we see that the overall effect is 150% greater in terms of releasing sugar into the bloodstream than if just one hormone was present. Finally, we have antagonism. Antagonism occurs when one hormone produces the opposite effects of another hormone. Antagonism can occur in three ways. One way antagonism can occur is through competition of receptors. Another way it can occur is when the hormones stimulate different metabolic pathways. And then a third way that antagonism occurs when one hormone causes downregulation for the receptors of another. Insulin and glucagon are a great example of antagonism. Both insulin and glucagon exert their effects through specific receptors on target cells. Insulin binds to insulin receptors, which are actually tyrosine kinase receptors that were shown in a previous slide, while glucagon binds to glucagon receptors, which are part of that whole second messenger system with the G protein. The receptors trigger different signaling pathways within the cells that ultimately regulate glucose metabolism. There are three different ways that endocrine glands can be stimulated to release their hormones. One of those ways is known as humoral stimulus, where changes in the levels within the blood of chemicals that are not hormones, like nutrients or ions, can cause the release or inhibition of the release of a hormone. An example of this is seen in the picture on the far left, where we have low levels of calcium detected in the bloodstream by the parathyroid glands. In response to low levels of calcium, the parathyroid glands will release parathyroid hormone into the bloodstream. As you remember from AMP1, parathyroid hormone, as it circulates through the bloodstream, will not only cause the stimulation of osteoclasts to break down hydroxyapatite, releasing calcium and phosphorus into the bloodstream, it will also circulate to the kidneys, helping them resorb calcium so it doesn't get excreted in urine, as well as to the intestines to help increase the absorption of calcium. That's an example of humoral stimulus. Neural stimulus occurs when hormones are released in response to neural stimuli. And this occurs when we see the preganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers coming from a neuron in the lateral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord going straight to the adrenal medulla. That's where norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to be released into the bloodstream as the result of sympathetic nervous system response. Lastly, we have hormonal stimulus, where endocrine glands secrete hormones in response to another hormone secreted by another endocrine gland. In the picture on the far right, you see that the hypothalamus is releasing a hormone to the anterior pituitary gland, which in turn releases hormones to other glands within the endocrine system and causes them to release hormones. That's all hormonal stimulus. You'll recall from AMP1 that the body regulates itself and maintains homeostasis largely by negative feedback mechanisms where the stimulus is reduced by the response. In this particular illustration, we see a gentleman eating something which is going to have the stimulus of a rise in his blood sugar levels, which are detected by receptors in the pancreas, and that information then gets sent to our control center, our brain, which in turn signals the pancreas to secrete insulin. And the effect of the secretion of insulin is not just on the liver cells, by the way. It's on pretty much all the cells in the body, especially muscle and fat cells, adipocytes, where those cells will take up the sugar that's in the bloodstream, thereby reducing blood sugar back to normal levels. So that's a great example of negative feedback direction, where if we go in one direction, increase blood sugar, we want to go back down the opposite direction to lower the blood sugar, and that's negative feedback. There are some positive feedback mechanism examples in the endocrine system where the stimulus is enhanced by the response, and breastfeeding is a great example of this, where when the baby is nursing and stimulating the areola around the nipple, that signal goes up to the brain, and the pituitary gland releases oxytocin and prolactin into the bloodstream. Oxytocin will circulate and cause the smooth muscle cells around the mammary glands, the myoepithelial cells, to contract, and that actually ejects milk out of the mammary glands. And prolactin tells the breast to make more milk, so the more the baby eats, the more the baby nurses, the more milk is produced. Conversely, if the baby doesn't eat as much, as the baby grows and is nursing less and less frequently because of the introduction of solid foods as the baby gets older, that will not stimulate the breasts to produce milk as much, and that's how that production eventually slows down and stops. I believe that takes us to the end of this particular series on the endocrine system. We're going to go ahead and I will do my best to record part 2 of 3 without too many bloopers.